I'm Isabella, 22, a woman, and my life took an unbelievable turn when my own father threw a plate of spaghetti at me just for saying no. It was a single word, a boundary I had every right to set, but in my father's house, his authority was the only thing that mattered. The hot, sticky noodles and the thick, red sauce clinging to my hair and my favorite sweater weren't just food, they were a message. They were the physical manifestation of years of simmering resentment, control, and his utter refusal to see me as anything more than an extension of himself. But what happened next, in the stunned, sauce-scented silence of our dining room, was something that would shatter the foundations of our family forever. The quietest person in the house was about to become the loudest. Our family lived in a two-story colonial house on a street where all the houses looked the same. From the outside, we were the picture of normalcy. There was my father, Richard, a man of 51 who owned a local hardware store and carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who believed he'd built his world with his own two hands. There was my mother, Linda, a gentle soul of 49 whose primary role in our family had become that of a professional shock absorber, soaking up my father's volatile moods to keep the peace. And then there was my grandfather, Arthur, my dad's father. At 75, he was a widower who had moved in with us after my grandmother passed away. He was a man of few words, a silent fixture in the corner of the living room, always reading a book or observing the world from behind a pair of thick-lensed glasses. His silence was a landscape I had spent my life trying to interpret, mostly assuming it was a quiet form of judgment. My father's temper wasn't a secret. It was a defining feature of our home life, like the creaky third step on the staircase or the hum of the old refrigerator. We all learned to navigate our lives around it, tiptoeing through conversations and carefully managing our actions to avoid setting him off. Looking back, I can see a trail of these emotional explosions, each one a small lesson in compliance. I remember one Saturday when I was about 16. My dad had sent me to the grocery store with a very specific list. He wanted a particular brand of imported coffee beans that he liked. I searched the aisle for what felt like an eternity, even asking a store employee for help, but they were out of stock. Knowing he wouldn't want a substitute in his world, a substitute was a failure, I bought everything else on the list and came home. I explained the situation calmly, presenting the receipt as evidence of my effort. He looked at the grocery bags, then at my face, and his jaw tightened. "Out of stock," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Did you even look properly?" I assured him I had. For a moment, he was silent. Then he picked up the ceramic coffee mug he was holding, a gift I'd given him for his birthday, and hurled it into the kitchen sink. It shattered into a dozen pieces. "Useless," he muttered, not looking at me but at the broken porcelain. My mother rushed in, saw the mess, and immediately started sweeping up the pieces. "Richard, it's just coffee," she whispered. Then she looked at me, her eyes pleading. "It's okay, sweetie, next time just try another store." The message was clear. His reaction was my fault for not trying hard enough. Another time during my senior year of high school, I brought home my report card. I was proud of it. I had all A's and one B plus in calculus. I'd struggled in that class, and a B plus was a victory I had earned through hours of studying. I handed the report card to my dad, expecting at least a nod of approval. He scanned it, his finger stopping on the B plus. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in disappointment. "A B plus," he said, tapping the paper. "What is this, Isabella? Are you getting lazy? An A is an A, this is average." I tried to explain how hard the class was, how much I had improved. He just shook his head. "Excuses? In my day, we didn't make excuses, we just did the work." He tossed the report card onto the coffee table as if it were contaminated. "You need to apply yourself." That night, I cried in my room, not because of the grade, but because my best effort was still seen as a failure. My mom came in later with a cup of tea. She sat on the edge of my bed and said the words I'd come to expect. "You know how he is. He just wants the best for you. Don't be upset." She was always reframing his cruelty as a strange form of love, a narrative that kept her from having to confront the truth. My grandfather was always present for these moments, a silent observer in the background. During the coffee mug incident, I remember glancing over at him in his armchair. He just turned a page in his book, his expression unreadable. After the report card lecture, he was sitting at the kitchen table and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of something. Pity, sympathy, but it was gone before I could be sure. He never intervened, never said a word in my defense. In my young mind, his silence was a form of agreement with my father. I concluded that he too saw me as a disappointment. It built a wall between us, a quiet, sorrowful distance I didn't know how to cross. These incidents and countless others like them taught me to be small to be agreeable. But something shifted when I discovered graphic design. In the world of color palettes, typography, and digital canvases, I found a voice. I started freelancing during college, building a portfolio and slowly gaining clients. After graduation, I decided to pursue it full-time from my childhood bedroom. It was my passion, my career, and the first thing in my life that felt entirely my own. My father, of course, called it my computer hobby. To him, real work involved calloused hands and physical inventory like at his struggling hardware store, and as his business faltered, his eyes turned to me not with pride but with a predatory sense of ownership. He saw my growing independence not as a success, but as a resource he was entitled to claim. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and this time I knew I couldn't just apologize to make it go away. The upcoming Sunday dinner was looming, and I could feel a storm gathering on the horizon. The air in our house on that particular Sunday was thick with unspoken tension. It was a feeling I knew well, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that vibrated just beneath the surface of our domestic routine. It was in the way my mother, Linda, moved about the kitchen with a forced, brittle cheerfulness, her hands fluttering as she checked the pot of boiling water for the pasta. It was in the way my father, Richard, sat in the living room, not watching the television but staring through it, the newspaper spread untouched on his lap. He was waiting. We were all waiting. For the past few weeks, he had been dropping hints, making comments that were like stones tossed into a calm pond, sending ripples of unease through me. Must be nice to sit in your room all day playing on the computer, he'd say as he walked past my door, or that little hobby of yours isn't going to pay the bills forever, you know. He was laying the groundwork, preparing his battlefield. His hardware store, Richard's Reliable Hardware, had become anything but reliable. Online retailers and big box stores had been slowly bleeding him dry for years, and his pride wouldn't let him adapt. Now, his quiet desperation was curdling into a familiar brand of authoritative anger. My grandfather, Arthur, sat in his usual armchair, a thick history book resting in his hands. He seemed placid, a stone in the river of our family's tension, letting the currents flow around him. But I noticed his eyes, more than usual, would lift from the page and watch my father. He was observing, calculating in that quiet way of his. I wished, not for the first time, that I knew what he was thinking. His silence felt like a heavy blanket, and I couldn't tell if it was meant to comfort or to smother. Dinner was served at precisely 6 o'clock, as it was every Sunday. My mom brought out a large platter of spaghetti with her homemade meat sauce, a salad, and garlic bread. It was my favorite meal, a comfort food from my childhood, but that day the smell of it just made my stomach clench. We sat at the polished oak dining table, the one my father had proudly declared a solid investment years ago. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were the scraping of forks and my mother's attempts at small talk. "The weather is supposed to be lovely this week," she said to no one in particular. "Maybe we can get some yard work done." My father ignored her. He finished chewing a mouthful of pasta, wiped his lips with a napkin, and fixed his gaze on me. The moment had arrived. "Isabella," he began, his voice leaving no room for discussion, "we need to finalize the plan for your transition." I felt my heart begin to beat a little faster. "What transition, Dad?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The transition to you working at the store," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I've been thinking about it, and it's the only sensible solution. Starting next Monday, you'll be there full-time, 9 to 5. We need the help, and it's time you started contributing to this family in a real way." I took a slow breath, gathering my thoughts. I had rehearsed this in my head 100 times. "Dad, we've talked about this. I already have a full-time job. My graphic design business is doing really well. I just signed 2 new clients last week." He waved his hand dismissively, a gesture that brushed away my entire career. "That's not a job, it's a hobby. It's you sitting in your pajamas, clicking a mouse. I'm talking about real work, a family business. You'll learn about inventory, customer service, accounting. G skills that will actually serve you in life." My business is real, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I have invoices, I have a registered business name, I pay taxes. It's my career and I love it. Love doesn't pay the mortgage, he shot back, his voice rising. The store is struggling, your family needs you. This is not a request, Isabella, it's what's happening. You live under my roof, you eat my food. The least you can do is help me keep that roof over our heads. I looked at my mother, searching for support. She was staring down at her plate, meticulously twirling a single strand of spaghetti around her fork. Her face was pale. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She had already surrendered. Then I looked at my grandfather. He had stopped eating. His fork was resting on the side of his plate, and he was watching the exchange between my father and me. His face was still unreadable, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was listening intently. I will not be quitting my job, I said, looking directly at my father. I kept my voice as level as I could, even though a tremor was running through me. My business is my future. I've worked so hard to build it. I can't just throw it away. Throw it away? He scoffed, his face beginning to redden. You think working for your own family is throwing something away? That's the problem with your generation. You're all selfish. It's all about me, me, me. What about us? What about the family that raised you? This isn't about being selfish, I argued, my voice shaking slightly now. This is about my life, my choices. You can't just decide my career for me. I'm an adult. An adult? He let out a short, bitter laugh. You're a child living in my house, playing at being a businesswoman. You don't know the first thing about the real world. I'm your father, and I know what's best for you. No, I said, and the word felt heavy and powerful in my mouth. It was a word I had rarely used with him. You know what's best for you and for the store. You're not thinking about me at all. The silence that followed was electric. My father's face, which had been red with anger, seemed to drain of all color. His eyes narrowed into slits. He looked at me, then at my mother's terrified face, then at my grandfather's stoic silence. It was as if he was daring anyone to challenge him. The finality in my voice, the simple two-letter word, was a defiance he could not tolerate. It was a direct challenge to the very core of his authority. He had pushed me into a corner, and instead of cowering, I had pushed back. I watched as his hand, which was resting on the table, clenched into a tight fist. The storm had not only arrived, it was about to break right over my head. The word no hung in the air between us, stark and absolute. It was a sound my father was not used to hearing, especially not from me and especially not at his own dining table. For a moment, everything stood still. My mother's fork was frozen halfway to her mouth. My grandfather's gaze was fixed on his son, his expression as unmoving as a granite cliff face. My father's eyes, however, were a whirlwind of disbelief turning into pure, unadulterated fury. What did you just say to me? He asked, his voice a low, threatening growl. It was the voice that always preceded an eruption, the rumbling before the earthquake. I held his gaze, my own fear battling with a newfound, fragile resolve. I said, no, Dad, I am not quitting my job. I will not be working at the store. He stared at me, a muscle twitching in his clenched jaw. I could see the internal struggle on his face. He was a man who saw the world in terms of control, and he was losing it. My refusal wasn't just a disagreement, it was an act of rebellion. In his eyes, I was dismantling the very structure of our family, a structure where his word was law. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. Ungrateful, he spat, the word dripping with venom. After everything I've done for you, everything I've provided, this is the thanks I get, disrespect in my own home. It's not disrespect, it's disagreement, I tried to reason, but I knew it was useless. He didn't hear my words, only my defiance. It is disrespect, he thundered, slamming his fist on the table. The plates and glasses jumped. My mother flinched as if she'd been struck. You stand there with your little fantasy job and you tell me no, you who has never had to worry about a single real thing in your life. He was breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling. His eyes darted around the table, landing on his own plate, still piled high with spaghetti and meatballs. It was as if a switch flipped behind his eyes. The last thread of his rationality snapped. With a motion that was both horrifyingly fast and yet felt like it was happening in slow motion, he reached out, grabbed his plate, and stood up. My moths. R gasped a small, choked sound. Richard, don't, she pleaded, but her voice was a whisper against a hurricane. He took a step towards me. I was frozen in my chair, a primal fear rooting me to the spot. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. I could only watch as he drew his arm back. And then he threw it. The plate flew through the air, wobbling slightly, a porcelain frisbee of rage. It didn't hit me, but the contents did. The spaghetti, slick with olive oil and tomato sauce, slapped against my chest and face with a wet, shocking impact. Strands of pasta clung to my hair and slid down my cheeks like grotesque tears. The warmth of the sauce soaked through my sweater, feeling hot and invasive against my skin. A meatball bounced off my shoulder and landed on the floor with a dull thud. The plate itself crashed against the wall behind me, shattering with a deafening crack that echoed the breaking of something far more important in that room. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the slow, deliberate drip, drip, drip of tomato sauce from the end of my nose onto the clean, white tablecloth. I slowly raised a trembling hand to my face and touched my cheek. It came away red and sticky. The humiliation washed over me in a wave that was far more painful than the impact itself. He hadn't just thrown food at me, he had branded me with his contempt. He had treated me not like a daughter, but like a wall he was throwing things against. In front of my mother, in front of my grandfather. I finally looked up at him. He was standing there, his arm still slightly outstretched, his face a mask of cold fury. There was no remorse in his eyes, no flicker of regret. There was only the grim satisfaction of a man who had made his point in the most visceral way possible. I turned my head to look at my mother. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with horror, her hands pressed against her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was silent. Paralyzed by her own fear, she was once again a spectator to my pain, unable or unwilling to step onto the field and defend me. Her inaction was a betrayal all its own. Finally, my gaze drifted to the end of the table to my grandfather. Throughout the shouting and the final, violent act, he had not moved a muscle. He was still sitting in his chair, his hands resting on the table, but his posture had changed. He was no longer a passive observer. He was sitting ramrod straight, and the unreadable expression on his face had hardened into something I had never seen before, a look of cold, clear, and absolute judgment. And it wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at his son. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and suffocating, but I knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that it was about to be broken. The silence in the dining room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the sound of another drop of sauce falling from my hair onto the tablecloth, a tiny, percussive beat marking the seconds of my humiliation. I sat there, draped in the remnants of my father's dinner and his rage, feeling a profound and chilling sense of isolation. My skin prickled, my eyes burned with unshed tears, and a deep, shuddering cold settled into my bones. My father, Richard, finally lowered his arm. He let out a heavy breath, a sound of grim finality, as if he had just completed a difficult but necessary task. He looked at the mess on me and the wall behind me, then at my face. Now, he said, his voice still hard but no longer shouting, maybe now you understand what happens when you disrespect me in my own house. He thought he had won. He thought this act of degradation was the period at the end of his sentence. That was when my mother, Linda, finally found her voice, though it was as thin and brittle as spun glass. Richard, my goodness, look at the mess. Her first words were not of concern for me, but for the state of her dining room. It was a small, heartbreaking detail that told me everything I needed to know. She scurried to her feet, grabbing a napkin from the table. Oh, Isabella, sweetie, let's get you cleaned up. Honestly, what a waste of good sauce. She came towards me, dabbing clumsily at my sauce-splattered cheek with a paper napkin, smearing it more than cleaning it. Her hands were trembling. Come on, let's go upstairs, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously towards my father. We'll get you into the shower. We can talk about this later when everyone has calmed down. Her words, meant to be soothing, felt like tiny, sharp cuts. When everyone has calmed down, as if I were an equal participant in this explosion, as if my quiet no was the match that lit his fuse, making us both responsible for the fire. I could hear the subtext, the familiar narrative she was already constructing in her mind. Richard had overreacted, yes, but Isabella had provoked him, if only Dee been more compliant, more agreeable, more like her, then the spaghetti would still be on the plate, and the peace, however fragile, would have been kept. I pulled away from her touch. Don't, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't bear her pretense of care, her desperate effort to smooth over the jagged edges of what had just happened. My father took her retreat as his cue to reassert his dominance. Leave her, Linda, he commanded. She can sit there and think about what she's done. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. What I've done, I finally found my voice, and it was filled with a trembling disbelief. What I've done, I set a boundary. I said no to you treating me like an indentured servant, that's what I did. You defied your father, he retorted, his voice rising again. You chose your little computer games over your own family. You made this choice, Isabella, not me. The sheer, staggering injustice of his words stole my breath. He was twisting reality itself, reshaping the events of the last 10 minutes into a narrative where he was the victim of my selfishness. I felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown me. I was completely and utterly alone in this. My mother was trying to mop up the problem, and my father was the unmovable, unrepentant source of it. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the movement clumsy and slow. I could feel spaghetti sliding down my back. I felt disgusting, degraded, and impossibly small. I'm going to my room, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was the only thing I could do, the only retreat available to me. As I turned to leave the dining room, my mother reached out a hand. Sweetie, wait. Just leave it, Mom, I said without looking at her. Please just leave it. I walked out of the room, past the living room where my grandfather still sat, and up the stairs. Each step felt like a monumental effort. I could feel my father's glare on my back, a physical weight of disapproval. I didn't look at my grandfather as I passed, but I felt his eyes on me, and for the first time, his silence didn't feel like judgment. It felt like the intake of breath before a storm. I reached my room and shut the door behind me, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly final. I leaned against the door, my body shaking uncontrollably now that I was out of their sight. I caught a glimpse of myself in the full-length mirror on my closet door. I was a caricature of misery. My brown hair was matted with red sauce, my face was streaked with grease, and my favorite cream-colored sweater was ruined, stained with a grotesque pattern of his anger. Tears I had refused to shed in front of them began to fall, hot and fast. They weren't just tears of sadness, but tears of rage. Rage at my father for his cruelty, rage at my mother for her weakness, and a deep, aching rage at myself for believing, for even a moment, that I could be seen as a person in that house, with thoughts and dreams worthy of respect. I stumbled into my attached bathroom and turned on the shower, not waiting for the water to warm up. I stripped off the soiled clothes, dropping them in a heap on the floor, and stepped into the icy spray. I scrubbed at my skin, wanting to wash off not just the sauce, but the feeling of his contempt, the stench of his control. But it was a stain that went deeper than my skin, and as I stood there, shivering under the cold water, I knew that no amount of soap could ever truly wash it away. I stayed in the shower until the water ran hot and then cooled again, my skin red and raw. I wrapped myself in the largest towel I owned and sat on the edge of my bed, listening. The house below was quiet, too quiet. The aftermath of my father's explosions was usually filled with the sounds of my mother's anxious cleaning, the clatter of dishes being washed with a little too much force, and the low murmur of the television he would turn on to fill the silence. But this was different. This was a heavy, waiting silence. After what felt like an hour, there was a soft knock on my door. Isabella, it was my mother. Sweetie, can I come in? I didn't answer. I didn't have the strength to face her, to hear her gentle, misguided attempts to broker a peace that would inevitably come at my expense. Isabella, please, she said through the door, her voice strained. Your father, he's upset. We just need to talk this through. If you would just come down and apologize for the misunderstanding, we can put this all behind us. Apologize, the word was like a physical blow. Apologize for being assaulted in my own home. Apologize for having a dream. The sheer absurdity of it was so overwhelming that I almost laughed. I have nothing to apologize for, I said, my voice loud and clear enough to carry through the wood. There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to find another angle, another way to smooth this over. H. Ease your father, she said finally, as if that explained everything. As if that one fact absolved him of all sins. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the tension from downstairs. It was a voice I rarely heard raised above a conversational murmur, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. Linda, stop it. It was my grandfather. The sound of his voice, firm and commanding, was so unexpected that I stood up and walked silently to my door, pressing my ear against it. I heard my mother's flustered reply, "Arthur, I'm just trying to fix this." "You can't fix this," my grandfather's voice replied, closer now as if he were at the bottom of the stairs. "You can't keep patching up a ship that your own captain insists on drilling holes in. Leave the girl alone. The person who needs to do the apologizing is right here." A tense silence followed, then my father's voice laced with indignant disbelief. "What did you say to me, old man?" "You heard me, Richard," Arthur said, his tone as cool and solid as river stone. "Get a towel and a bucket of water. You're going to go upstairs and clean the sauce off the wall that you splattered like a child." My father let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You must be losing your mind. I'm not cleaning anything. She got what she deserved for her insolence." This was the moment. This was the crescendo I had been waiting for my entire life without even knowing it. I slowly, silently turned the knob on my door and opened it just a crack, peering down into the hallway and the top of the staircase. I could see them all in the foyer below. My father stood with his arms crossed, a sneer on his face. My mother was wringing her hands, looking back and forth between her husband and her father-in-law, her face a mask of panic, and my grandfather. He stood at the foot of the stairs, small in stature compared to my father, but radiating an aura of immovable strength. He looked older, more tired than I'd ever seen him, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "She deserved it," my grandfather repeated, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent house. "She deserved to be humiliated, to have you throw food at her like she was an animal, because she has ambition, because she has built something for herself that you didn't hand to her." "This is my house and my family," my father shot back. "You have no say here." My grandfather took a slow step forward. He reached into the inner pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small, folded-up piece of paper. He held it up. "That's where you're wrong, Richard. This isn't your house." My father stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about? Of course it's my house. I've paid the mortgage on it for 25 years. "You've paid the bank," my grandfather corrected him gently. "But you've been paying it to a mortgage that is attached to a deed that I hold, a deed that is and has always been solely in my name." The air went out of the room. My mother gasped and put her hand over her heart. My father's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of slack-jawed shock. He looked from the paper in my grandfather's hand to his face, utterly bewildered. "You're lying," my father stammered. "Am I?" Arthur asked. "Think back, Richard. When your mother and I gave you the down payment for this place, it was our gift to help you start your family, but I never signed the title over. We had a lawyer draw it up so that you would assume the payments, but ownership would only transfer upon my death. Your mother, God rest her soul, she worried. She saw your temper even then. She said, 'Arthur, what if he loses everything in a fit of anger one day? What about the children?' I told her she was worrying for nothing, but she made me promise I would keep this as a safety net for the family." He refolded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket. "For years, I thought she was wrong. I thought you had matured. But tonight you showed me she was right all along. I have sat in my chair and watched you bully your wife and your daughter for the last time." He pointed a slightly trembling finger at my father. "This house, Richard, is my house, and I will not have this kind of behavior under my roof, so here is what is going to happen. You are going to apologize to Isabella, a real apology, and you are going to treat her and your wife with the respect they deserve from now on. If you cannot do that, then you will be the one looking for a new place to live, not her." From my vantage point at the top of the stairs, I watched my father crumble. The foundation of his entire world, his authority, his very identity as the king of his castle, had just been demolished by the quietest man I had ever known. His face was pale, his mouth hung open, and his eyes, for the first time in my life, were filled not with anger but with fear. The power in our family had just shifted completely and irrevocably, and I stood there watching it. P-Pen, my own shock slowly being replaced by a dawning, brilliant sense of hope. The aftermath of my grandfather's revelation was not loud or explosive. It was a deafening silence, filled with the wreckage of my father's authority. Richard stood frozen in the foyer, his face a pallid shade of gray. The blustering, domineering man who had thrown spaghetti at me less than an hour ago was gone, replaced by a deflated, hollowed-out version of himself. He stared at his own father as if seeing him for the first time, not as a quiet old man in an armchair, but as the ultimate arbiter of his fate. My mother, Linda, looked as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her hands covering her mouth. Her entire world had been built around the careful management of my father's ego, and that ego had just been publicly and systematically dismantled. She had no script for this. My grandfather, Arthur, turned his gaze from his son and looked up the stairs directly at me. His eyes, which I had so often misinterpreted as distant or disapproving, were filled with a profound and gentle kindness. There was no "I told you so" in his expression, only a quiet, steady support that felt more solid than anything I had ever known. "Isabella," he said, his voice soft again, "are you all right?" I could only nod, my throat too tight with emotion to speak. I walked slowly down the stairs, my bare feet cold on the wood. I stopped a few steps above my mother, my eyes locked with my grandfather's. He then turned back to my father. "Well, Richard, your daughter is waiting." My father flinched. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with a mixture of shame, resentment, and utter confusion. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The words wouldn't come. An apology was a foreign language to him, and he couldn't force his tongue to form the shapes. Finally, he mumbled something towards the floor. "I'm sorry." It was a ghost of a word, devoid of feeling or sincerity, choked out by a lifetime of pride. It didn't matter. The apology wasn't for him, it was for me, and hearing it, however weak, was the closing of a chapter. But my grandfather wasn't finished. He stepped towards me, bypassing his son and daughter-in-law as if they were pieces of furniture. He stopped in front of me and placed a warm, dry hand on my arm. "This is not a healthy place for you to grow, my dear," he said, his voice full of a sorrowful wisdom. "You have a light in this house. It works very hard to dim it. I will not allow that anymore." He looked me straight in the eye. "I've been saving for a rainy day. Well, from where I'm standing, it seems to be pouring. Tomorrow, you and I are going to find you an apartment, a place of your own where you can build your business and your life in peace. I will cover your deposit and first few months' rent so you can have a proper start." Tears, hot and genuine, welled in my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. This time they weren't tears of humiliation, but of overwhelming gratitude. To be seen, truly seen, for the first time by a member of my own family was a gift so immense I could barely comprehend it. This quiet, unassuming man had not only defended me, he was offering me the one thing I craved more than anything: freedom. "Thank you, Grandpa," I whispered, and the words felt impossibly small for the magnitude of what he had just done. I threw my arms around him, burying my face in his cardigan that smelled faintly of old books and peppermint. He held me tightly, patting my back. It was perhaps the first time he had hugged me since I was a little girl. The days that followed were surreal. The atmosphere in the house was thick with a tense, oppressive silence. My father was a ghost, moving from room to room without a word, his eyes avoiding mine. My mother tried to act as if nothing had happened, speaking of trivial things like the weather and what to make for dinner, but her voice was strained and her cheerfulness was a thin, cracking veneer over a deep well of anxiety. She was caught between a husband whose authority she no longer understood and a daughter who was now allied with the family's new, quiet patriarch. True to his word, my grandfather and I spent the next 2 days looking for apartments. It was a strange and wonderful experience. He was patient and practical, pointing out things I would have missed, like the quality of the windows or the water pressure in the shower. We talked more in those 2 days than we had in the past 10 years. He told me stories about my grandmother, about his time as a young man, and he asked me about my business with genuine interest, his eyes lighting up as I explained my work. I was discovering a whole new person, a man of depth and humor who had been hidden in plain sight all along. We found a perfect one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a clean, quiet building downtown. It had big windows that let in lots of natural light, and a small nook that was perfect for a home office. When I signed the lease, with my grandfather standing proudly beside me, I felt a thrill of independence so pure it made me dizzy. Moving day was quiet. My grandfather helped me pack my boxes and load them into his old but reliable station wagon. My father was nowhere to be seen. He'd left early that morning for the store. My mother hovered in the doorway, her face a sad, complicated mess of emotions. As I carried the last box out, she hugged me, her grip surprisingly tight. "You'll call, won't you?" she asked, her voice thick. "Of course, Mom," I said. I knew she loved me in her own way. Her tragedy was that she loved peace more. Driving away from that house was like exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 22 years. As I watched it shrink in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel sadness. I felt relief. That evening, I stood in the middle of my empty living room, surrounded by boxes. The setting sun streamed through the large window, casting long, golden shadows on the floor. It was quiet. It was mine. My grandfather had left an hour earlier after helping me assemble my bed and leaving me with a container of my grandmother's favorite cookies. Before he left, he hugged me again. "Be happy, Isabella," he'd said. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. The faint smell of new paint and limitless possibility filled my lungs. The stain of the spaghetti was finally beginning to fade. 6 months flew by in a blur of creative energy and newfound peace. My little apartment, once a space of empty rooms and stacked boxes, had transformed into a home, my home. The nook by the window became the heart of my expanding graphic design business. Without the constant, low-level stress of living in my father's house, my creativity flourished. I took on more ambitious projects, my portfolio grew, and my client base doubled. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. My relationship with my grandfather blossomed in a way I never could have imagined. We established a new tradition, dinner every Thursday night. Sometimes we'd go out to a quiet restaurant, other times I'd cook for him in my apartment. During these dinners, he opened up to me, sharing pieces of his life and wisdom that had been locked away for years. He told me that his silence had never been disapproval of me, but a deep, sorrowful disappointment in the man his son had become. He'd stayed quiet, he admitted, out of a misplaced hope that Richard would one day grow out of his anger. That night, he told me, his eyes full of a lingering sadness, I realized that hope was a fool's errand, and my silence wasn't protecting the peace, it was enabling the tyranny. His words were a balm on old wounds I didn't even know I still had. He became my mentor, my confidant, and my dearest friend. My contact with my parents, on the other hand, was strained and sporadic. My father had never offered a real apology. We'd seen each other at a family holiday gathering, and the interaction was painfully awkward. He was quiet, sullen, and treated me with a distant formality, as if I were a business acquaintance he was forced to endure. The power he'd lost had been replaced by a wall of resentment. He couldn't forgive me for being the catalyst for his humiliation, and he couldn't forgive his own father for being the one to finally hold him accountable. Our relationship was fractured, perhaps permanently, and while a part of me mourned the father I wished I had, a larger part of me was relieved to be free from the father I actually got. My mother called me once a week. Our conversations were always the same. They skimmed the surface of our lives, filled with talk about the weather, her garden, and her latest attempts to get my father to cheer up. She would often end the call with a wistful sigh and the words, "I just wish we could all go back to the way things were." She never understood that for me, the way things were was the problem. She longed for the familiar comfort of a dysfunctional system, while I was finally breathing the clean air of a functional life. I loved her, but I could no longer live in her world of carefully constructed denial. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, finishing a logo design for a new client. The city lights twinkled outside my window. My apartment was quiet, filled only with the soft music playing from my speakers and the gentle hum of my computer. I thought back to that horrible Sunday dinner, to the feeling of the hot spaghetti on my skin and the soul-crushing humiliation that followed. It was, without a doubt, the worst moment of my life, but it was also the moment everything changed. It was the crack in the dam that allowed a lifetime of repressed truth to finally pour through. That night, my father's rage didn't break me, it liberated me. And my grandfather, the silent man in the corner, taught me that this most powerful strength doesn't always come from the loudest voice. Sometimes it comes from a quiet, unwavering conviction held in reserve until the moment it is needed most. He didn't just give me a key to an apartment, he gave me the key to my own life. I was no longer Isabella, the disappointing daughter. I was Isabella, the master of my own destiny, the builder of my own future. And I was finally truly happy. So, to anyone out there who feels trapped in a situation that seems impossible, I want you to hear my story. To anyone who feels their voice is too small to make a difference, or that the people who are supposed to love you will never truly see you, please don't give up hope. Sometimes your greatest ally is sitting in the one place you never thought to look, and your moment of liberation can be born from your moment of greatest pain. What do you think I should do about my father? Should I try to rebuild a relationship, or is it better to keep my distance for my own well-being?